Let's take a look at the Gemara on the bottom of Ayin Hey Amud Beis. We had learned yesterday in the Mishnah having to do with juices or gravy that flows out of the Korban Pesach while it's roasting. If it hits other items and then splashes back onto the Korban Pesach, so then sometimes that's going to be usur, because it turns out that those juices have not been cooking exclusively through fire, they've been cooking through those foreign objects as well. So there's a very popular sugya, a very important sugya, about how things get heated up when you have the meeting of two substances. And it's a very important machlokas to know when you study Yoredeya, the laws of kashrus. And that's the sugya today. Itmar cham l'so cham, if you have a hot substance that falls into another hot substance. And the example that we'll use is a piece of meat that falls into a bowl of milk or a pot of milk. Hot piece of meat that falls into hot milk. So divrei hakol aser. So everyone will agree that the meat, and of course the milk as well, are going to exchange flavor with each other, and therefore the meat's going to be usur and the milk will be usur. If, however, a cold piece of meat falls into cold milk, everyone agrees that that's no problem. There's been no exchange of flavor, and as we'll see, it's sufficient just to wash it off. If, however, you have hot falling into cold or cold falling into hot, Rav Amar Ila Gavar, Shmuel Amar Tata Gavar. So this is where we have our machlokas. Rav says that the substance that is on top is the controlling substance. That's the substance that is in control of the transfer of flavor. So therefore, if the top substance is hot, so then that's going to control the entire system to heat up the bottom part. That's where we say the upper controls, or the upper has ascendancy, or has dominance, because it, through coming in contact with the cold substance below it, will heat the cold substance below it. Shmuel says just the opposite. Shmuel says, no, it's tata agavar, that it's the object on the bottom that is the controlling substance. So if the bottom substance is hot, it will heat the substance on top of it. So they argue both on ila agavar and on tata agavar, but there's it's two machloksim, which is really four, because according to Rav, if the top substance is cold and the bottom substance is hot, then there's no problem. And according to Shmuel, the same thing. If the top substance is cold and the bottom top substance is hot and the bottom substance is cold, according to Shmuel, there's no problem either.
They consider weight or volume in this?
No. Okay, it's a valid point, obviously. But the Gemara is talking about in an average system where the sizes of the two components are about the same. Okay? So now the Gemara says, Tanan. So now let's take a look at our Mishnah. Nataf merot v'al acheres v'chazer elov yitoles mekomo. Our Mishnah had said that if some of the juices from the Korban Pesach drips out onto a shard of pottery, and then, for whatever reason, it splashes back onto the Korban Pesach, it absorbs back into the Korban Pesach after having come in contact with the pottery, the halacha is that juice is not kosher, and therefore if it absorbed back into the Korban Pesach, you have to take netilas makom, you have to take the chunk of meat that absorbed the gravy and remove it. So kasal kadaitach becheres tzonenas. Our thinking initially is that we're dealing with a cold piece of earthenware. So bishlam al-rav da amri la gavar misham hachi yitoles makoma. It works out well according to Rav, who says that the upper substance controls, because basically that's why the gravy now becomes usur, because the azal rotev merateach le lecheres v'hadr cheres merateach le lerotev. Because since the upper substance, the juice that falls on top of the pottery, is the controlling substance and it is hot, it will then heat up the earthenware shard, then receive some of its cooking from the earthenware shard that has now been heated, and then it will go back into the meat of the Korban Pesach. So essentially what you have is v'chihadar rotev ha'pesach kamatvi pesach machmas chaminusa decheres. Then it turns out that this gravy has been cooked by both the fire and by the cheres, and therefore when it reabsorbs into the flesh of the Korban Pesach, it's not permitted, because then any substance of the Korban Pesach has to be roasted directly by fire and not through anything else, and this gravy has received some of its cooking through the cheres, and therefore it's not kosher. Alalishmol da Amar Tatagav Archeres Kevin Ditzonin who Akuri Maker Leilarotev Amayitolis Makomo. But according to Shmuel, I don't understand. If you're telling me according to Shmuel that you look at the bottom substance as the controlling substance, if it's cold, therefore there's no exchange that takes place between the bottom and the top, and therefore the bottom substance will cool off the top substance. So when the hot gravy falls on the cold shard of earthenware, then there's not going to be the gravy will cool off. It won't be controlled by the cheres, it'll be cooled off by the cheres. So when it goes back into the Korban Pesach, there shouldn't be anything wrong with it. It's not being cooked by the cheres at all. So the Gemara answers, Kida Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Omar Shmuel B'solis Rosachas Hachanami B'cheres Roseach. As we'll see in a moment, we're going to see that Rabbi Yirmiyah says that the type of flour that we're dealing with in the Mishnah is hot flour. Now what do we mean by that? What do we mean by that when we talk about hot flour? There's the other case in the Mishnah that told us that when you have flour and the gravy falls on top of the flour, so you have to remove the absorbed part, the part of the flour that absorbed the gravy. And the question that Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to addressing is the very same question momentarily. And in order to explain it, Rabbi Yirmiyah said we're talking about hot flour because the hot flour, which is on the bottom, is the controlling substance that essentially cooks the gravy. And since the gravy is cooked partially by the flour, therefore it's forbidden gravy, and therefore it has to be removed. So the same thing we'll say by the earthenware shard. The earthenware shard is hot when the gravy falls on top of it, and therefore it's perfectly consistent according to Shmuel, who says Tata Agavar, who says that it's the bottom substance that controls. Since it is hot, it's going to be cooking the gravy. When the gravy therefore goes back into the Korban Pesach, it's a forbidden substance. So Tanan. Now let's take a look at that case of the flour. Notaf meirot volas solis yikmotzes makoma. That if some of the gravy falls onto flour, you have to remove that area where the gravy absorbed into the flour. So kasalka daitach besolis tsonenes. Our thinking is that we're talking about cold flour. Bishlam al-rav da amar ilah gavra mishum hachi yikmotzes makoma demirateach lo lesoles. Dahadar hodrane v'hadrasolos u'merasachale ledidei v'komat virote v'machmas chami musa desoles. I can understand according to Rav why is this gravy a forbidden substance? Because even though the flour is cold, since ilah gavar, the upper substance controls the system, since it is hot, it will heat up the flour. The flour in turn will therefore heat up the gravy, will transfer back heat to the gravy. The gravy then will be partially cooked through the flour. And therefore, this is not sliesh. V'rachmana amar sliesh v'lo sli machmas davar acher. And the Torah requires that the gravy and all the components of the Korban Pesach be roasted only by the fire and not by anything else. So that's why, according to Rav, this gravy is aser. Elulishmol damar tataga rasolas kevin ditzonenesi akuri kameker le lamali yichmotzes makoma. But according to Shmuel, who says that the bottom substance, when it's cold, there's not going to be any transfer of flavor, any control whatsoever, any heat transfer from the bottom to the top. So then why should there be a problem? The gravy will be cooled by the flour, and the flour won't be heated by the gravy, and therefore this gravy has been exclusively cooked by the fire. There shouldn't be any problem. Why do you have to remove the area where the gravy absorbed? So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel B'solos Rosachas. And that's where Rabbi Yirmiyah gives his answer in the name of Shmuel, that we're dealing with hot flour. In other words, you could say that we're talking about flour that's in the bottom of the oven where the Korban Pesach is roasting, so it too got hot. And therefore, when the gravy falls on top of it, the gravy then is partially cooked by the hot flour, so if it absorbs into the flour, you have to remove it because it's forbidden gravy. It's not sliesh. Tanan. Sacho b'shemen shel truma. Now let's look at another part of our Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that if you smear the Korban Pesach carcass with oil, that is truma oil, im chaburas kohanim yochlu im shel Yisrael, that if it's kohanim that are exclusively partaking in the Korban Pesach, no problem. But if they're Yisraelim, so then you have problems. Im chayhu yadichenu. So if it's still raw and you haven't cooked it yet, no problem, just rinse it off, right? However, im tzlihu yiklof es achitzon. But if it's roasted, you got hot roasted meat and you're putting oil on top of it, so then you have to take off a razor thin layer off of the entire exterior. So the Gemara now says, Bishlam al-Rav do amar ilah gavar amato lahachisagile biklipa mishum de ilah tzonenu. I can understand, according to Rav, why is a razor thin layer on the exterior sufficient? If you're going to tell me tata agavar, that should not be sufficient. The oil should absorb completely inside. According to Rav, it works out well. Since the controlling substance is the upper substance and it is cold, so there's not going to be much absorption into the flesh of the carcass. Maybe a tiny little bit because the carcass is still hot, and because it may have some fissures that have formed in it, maybe a little bit will seep in. That's why the Mishnah requires you to take off a klipa. But according to Shmuel, Ela l'Shmuel damer tatagaver kevin dechamu mivla bola ma'isagile beklipa nitzer legamre. But according to Shmuel, who says that the bottom substance, which is the carcass, is the controlling substance, so then it's hot. It's going to fully absorb the oil, and you should completely prohibit the carcass, not just the outer layer. Shiny sicha de mashu ba'almahu de avida. Answers the Gemara, because when you smear the exterior with oil, it's just a very thin layer of oil. So therefore, it can't permeate more than just its own width, and that's why a kedei klipa is sufficient. Tanya kavase di Shmuel. So now the Gemara is going to say, in this machlokus between Rav and Shmuel, we paskin like Shmuel, even though normally we paskin like Rav b'Isurei, but since we have brises that go according to Shmuel, we're going to paskin like Shmuel. It's one of those unique situations. We paskin tata agavar. We paskin that the bottom substance is the controlling substance. So if it is hot, then there will be a transfer and a cooking, and if not, then it's not a problem. This has ramifications in Hilchos Shabbos, by the way. Let's say you have a davar gush. Let's say you have a solace, like a piece of hot chicken that is put on your plate. So there are poskim who say that a davar gush, even when it's taken out of a kli rishon, still has a din of a kli rishon. So if you were to take some kind of cold liquid, like a dressing or something like that, and pour it over the hot chicken on Shabbos, you could potentially be liable for bishul, because we say tata agavar. By contrast, if you were to take the something hot and put it on top of the cold, that's less of a problem. There might still be an issue of just the kedei klipa that might be problematic, but just something to keep in mind. Tanya kavase di Shmuel. So we have now this brisa that supports Shmuel. Cham l'so cham aser, that if hot goes into hot, it's aser. V'chein sonei nishonasen l'so cham aser. And this is the line that goes like Shmuel. If something cold goes into something hot, and one is milk and one is meat, so then it's going to be aser, because since the bottom substance is hot, it's the controlling substance, it creates that exchange. Cham l'soch tzonein v'tzonin l'soch tzonein mediach. And finally, if it's hot into cold, then that's not a problem according to Shmuel. And sonein l'soch tzonein, and certainly cold into cold, in both of those cases, just rinse off the piece of meat and you're fine. So frek the Gemara, cham l'soch tzonein mediach, you mean to tell me that even when hot falls into cold milk, hot meat falls into cold milk, you just have to rinse off the meat and that's it? Kevin decham hu ademaker le'ef shadalo bola porta kli hamiani boy. The Gemara says, I don't understand. Look, you're right that the milk is cold, so it's going to cool off the meat. But for that slight instant, where the meat's not going to go immediately from 200 degrees to 50 degrees, right? It's not going to go like that. It's going to take a few seconds, or a couple of seconds at least, for it to be cooled off. In that instant, it's going to be absorbing some small amount of the milk, so at least a klipa you should have to remove from the exterior of the piece of milk. Ela ema, but rather you have to say, cham l'soch tzonein kolef, tzonein l'soch tzonein mediach. But rather, says the Gemara, it works like this. If hot falls into cold, you just have to remove the outer layer, and if cold falls into cold, then you have to then all you have to do is rinse it off. You're right, says the Gemara. Tanya idach, we have another brisa that supports Shmuel as well. Basar roseach shenafel l'sachalav roseach. If you have hot meat that falls into hot milk, v'chein sonein shenafel l'socham, or if you have cold meat that falls into hot milk, aser. In both of those cases, it's going to be aser. Very, very much confirming Shmuel. Cham l'soch sonein v'sonein l'soch sonein mediach. But if you have hot that falls into cold, or cold that falls into cold, all you have to do is rinse off the piece of meat. So frek the Gemara once again. Cham l'soch tzonein mediach. How can you tell me that if a hot piece of meat falls into cold milk, then washing it off is sufficient? Kevin dechamu ademaker le'ef shadalo bola porta klipa miani boy. Like we said before, invariably it's not going to cool off in a split second. It's going to take a couple of seconds. During that time, it'll invariably absorb a little bit of milk. So ela ema cham l'soch tzonein kolef tanon l'soch tzonein mediach. You're right, says the Gemara. Really, what it means is is that when hot falls into cold, you take off a thin layer on the exterior. When cold falls into cold, nothing gets transferred, and therefore you just have to wash it off. Amar Mar, let's go back. That if cold falls into cold, you have to just wash off the piece of meat. Amar Rav Huna lo shano ela shelo molcho. So Rav Huna qualifies this, and he says that's only provided that nothing has been salted. But salt will many times create a chemical situation whereby it's almost as if there's heat. In other words, salt sometimes equals heat, and just like heat will create a transfer of flavor from one substance to the other, a cooking, so too salt will do the same thing. Because Shmuel had said that when something is salted, it creates a situation of tantamount to cooking. Okay, and therefore, if either the milk is salted or the meat is salted and they come in contact and via salt medium, so then it's going to be problematic even though the milk is cold. So, in a similar vein, Shmuel had said that if something is pickled in a brine, that also is like cooking it. So therefore, if you were to take a kosher piece of meat and put it into pig brine, right? So then, brine mixed with pig gravy. So even though it's cold, as long as you waited the amount of time that it would take to heat up this object, if you could imagine putting it on a fire, even though it's still cold, the halacha is that the meat will become aser. Amar Rava, Hada Amar Shmuel Maliach Harehu Kiroseach, Lo Amar Shlo Nechel Machmas Malcho, Val Nechel Machmas Malcho Lo. Shmuel, however, we're going to qualify this further. When Shmuel says that salt is like heat, that's only true if the food item is so salty that it wouldn't normally be eaten. Like brine, you don't normally just drink brine. But if something is salty, but it's not so salty that you wouldn't eat it, it's salty and it's salted like seasoned for a person's consumption, that's not enough saltiness to consider it like it's hot. So, I will give an example. Hahu bar gozala denafal lakada dekimcha sharye Rav Chinana berei derava mi pasrunya. So there was once a case of like a Cornish hen that fell into a container of kutach, our friend the kutach, which is made out of sour milk and breadcrumbs. And here the kutach is very salty. Okay, and nevertheless Rav Chinana, the son of Rava mi Pasrunya, nevertheless said it's permitted. So Amar Rava man chakim lemishra milsa kiha. He says, who was wise enough, like this man who permitted it? Ilav Rav Chinana berei de Rava mi Pasrunya de gaver Rabahu. If there wasn't this fellow Rav Chinana around, we wouldn't have been able to find someone who was wise enough to permit it. Because Amar Lacha, because Rav Chinana will tell you, Ki Amar Shmuel Maliach Harehu Kiroseach Sheinechel Machmas Malcho, but Hainechel Machmas Malcho. The only time that the saltiness of a food makes it like it's heated is only when it's so salty that you wouldn't normally eat it. However, this kutach is something that people regularly eat, and it's just seasoned right for human consumption, and therefore it's not considered to be so salty that it's like it's hot. V'hani milichai, but then the Gemara says another qualification. When we said that when cold falls into cold, it's never a problem, just rinse off the meat, that's only when the meat is raw. Aval tzli boy klipa. But if it's roasted, even when it's a cold piece of roasted meat, you have to remove the outer surface, and the reason is because roasted meat is softened by the roasting process, and therefore it'll absorb just a little bit into the outer periphery. And furthermore, when it's roasted, the only time that we just allow you to remove a klipa is only when there are not big cracks in the meat. But if the meat was really well done, very well roasted, such that it began to form fissures on the surface, so then we consider the meat the milk to absorb completely, even when it's cold, and therefore the whole piece of meat will be aser. The imetovel betavli aser, and furthermore, if the meat is seasoned in such a way that it's almost like you marinated it in seasoning such that it softens the exterior of the meat, then if it falls into milk afterwards, so then that too will be problematic, and because it's going to consider the meat is so soft it absorbs the milk even when it's cold. Amar Rav, basar shchuta shamein shetzloim basar nevela kachush aser. Now we get into another sugya, which is another very important Yoredeya sugya called the sugya of Reicha Milsa. Do we say that the aroma of a cooking substance has the same halachic status of the food itself, that from which the aroma is emanating. So this has very practical applications in halacha as well. Can I cook or bake two things in the oven at the same time if one is milchiks and one is fleishiks, right? Now, they're not connected at all. They're not touching at all. They're on two different, totally different racks, but they're both exposed, and the aroma of one is wafting into the other food, and vice versa.
And they're covered, presumably.
No, I said they're not covered. That's the whole issue. Is it permitted? That's the question. Is it permitted because they're both exposed, and you have the aromas of each one? When they're covered, there is no reach according to halacha. So I'm just saying this is a question in halacha, and you'll see this is now the halachic discussion. You have two pieces of meat that are exposed inside an oven. One is very fatty, and the one that is fatty is the kosher piece of meat, and the one that is very lean and therefore does not emanate a strong aroma is a piece of treif. If they're in the oven together, Rav says that they're both going to be aser. And the reason why is my taima mifatmi mehadadi. The reason is because the aroma from the fatty piece of kosher meat will drift over to the non-kosher piece of meat. It will enter into the non-kosher piece of meat and cause that non-kosher piece of meat to generate its own aroma. In other words, the aroma of the fatty piece of meat has so much potency, not only to give off its own aroma, but also to permeate the lean piece of meat and to cause it to generate its own aroma, and therefore the aroma of the non-kosher meat will drift back into the kosher piece of meat, and therefore it will aser it. That's what's going on. So aroma is a product of some kind of fat product that is in the food that is cooking. And it is considered to be so substantive that the aroma itself carries with it the fattiness of the food that it comes from, so that when it permeates the lean object, it infuses the lean object with fattiness also, and therefore it causes the lean object to generate its aroma as well. And that's why Rav says that both pieces of meat are aser. V'Levi Omar afilu basar shchuta kalcha shetzloim basar nevela shamein mutar. And Levi disagrees, and he says that no, even if the kosher meat is lean and the non-kosher meat is fatty, then you cook them in the same oven, they're still both going to be permitted. My time arecha ba'almahu v'recha lav milsi. The reason is because Levi says that aroma is insignificant according to halacha. It does not transfer from one to the other. Avid Levi uvda bereish kalusa b'gediva davar acher. And to wit, Levi once paskined for the reish kalusa when they were roasting a goat and a pig in the same oven, that Levi says that the goat is still kosher. Don't try this at home. Okay. Now, by the way, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a whole tshuva on we generally paskin that reicha lav milsa, but we limit that leniency to when the ovens are large. Rav Moshe paskin that our ovens are not considered to be large ovens, and therefore you have to be machmir at least lechatchila that reicha is milsa, and you're not allowed to cook dairy and meat in the same oven at the same time, if one of them is exposed. If both of them are covered, then it's okay to cook them in the oven at the same time. But again, as a matter of practice, I don't recommend it, but technically it's acceptable to cook milk and meat in the oven at the same time as long as they're covered and there's no aroma.
The kelis aren't affected.
Kalim are not a problem either. They're not touching each other.
I know, we just thought maybe the reach.
There's no reach. You covered it.
But the outside of the cover is exposed to the reach.
Yeah.
What do you mean the outside of
the outside of the keli?
If you cover both, there's no reach coming out of either food.
I see what you're saying.
Okay. So the Gemara now says, Meisve. Let's challenge this. Ein solin shnei psachim ke'echad mipnei hatarovis. There's a brisa that says that you're not allowed to roast two korban pesachs in the same oven because of mixture. Now, what does mixture mean? My lav tarovis ta'amim v'kashil levi. It must mean that we're worried that the aroma of korban pesach A will get into korban pesach B and vice versa, and the people that are part of chabura A are not allowed to eat korban pesach B, but by having the aroma of B get into A, they're consuming korban pesach B, and that's not permitted. That's why it's aser. And therefore it shows that Yurecha Milsa, and it's a Kashan Levi. So the Gemara says, Lo, Mipnei Tarovis Gufin. No, the Gemara says, you didn't understand. It's not because of the mixture of aromas, but rather our concern is that you may get famished, you may get confused, and you'll, instead of taking your Korban Pesach, you'll take the other guy's Korban Pesach, and they'll get all switched. And that'll be disastrous. The Gemara says, "Hachanami mistavra mitakatani seifa filu gediu tleh," and it makes sense to say that that's what it means. You're worried about swapping the carcasses. Why? Because it says in the seifa that that halacha that you're not allowed to roast the two of them in the same oven is true even when one is a goat and one is a lamb. So iomart bishal mipnei guf and hainu dekatani afilu gediu tleh, ela iomart mipnei tarovis ta'amim mali gediu tleh mali gediu gedi. So the Gemara says it makes sense to say that because look. He says, if your concern is only that you may end up swapping the carcasses, then I could understand why there's a greater chiddush to tell me that it's prohibited even when they're two different species, where there's much less likelihood that you're going to swap the carcasses, and yet it's still usher, right? But if the issue is reicha, then what difference would it make if the aroma is coming from two goats to each other, or whether it's coming from one goat and one lamb to each other? So why does the brisa have to say even if it's a goat and a lamb? It's not an even. It's the same thing if you're dealing with aroma concerns. So elamai al karchach mimtei tarovis gufen huda aser avol tarovis ta'amim shari. So you see from here that the brisa is only concerned about a swapping of the carcasses, and it's not concerned about the reicha. It's not concerned about the aroma. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then leimati haviti ufte de Rab. Then maybe this brisa is a challenge to Rab, who says that you have to be concerned with aroma. The brisa apparently is unconcerned. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah hacha b'mayaskina kigon shitzalao b'shtei kederos. The Gemara says the reason why we're not worried about aroma here is because you're roasting each Korban Pesach in a separate pot. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? B'shtei kederos al gedaitach. Since when can you roast a Korban Pesach in a pot? It has to be over an open fire. So the Gemara says, Ela ema ke'ein shtei kederos v'hachi kamer, ein solin shnei psachim kecha b'pnei tarovis. So rather it means it's like there's two pots, which means the karbanos are completely, the carcasses are completely segregated. Rashi says, let's say by a wall of ash or a mound of coals dividing the oven from floor to ceiling. And so therefore there's no concern about reach here, because the reach won't be able to travel from one side of the oven to the other because of that segregation between the two. And what is therefore the concern? The brisa says you're not allowed to roast them together because of mixture. Mai tarovis tamim. What's the concern? The concern is a mixture of aromas. Vafilu kein shtei kederos teleka tarovis tamim asur mishum tarovis gufen. And even when you can obviate the problem of mixing aromas together because you've got some kind of partition between the two, nevertheless you still have to worry about possibly swapping them accidentally, and therefore even when you can clearly identify which one is what, there's still a fear that you may end up swapping them accidentally, and therefore you can't even roast a goat and a lamb in the same oven. Amar Rav Mari Kitanai. Rav Mari now says this machlokas between Rav and Levi as to whether reicha is milsa or reicha is lav milsa is a machlokas tanoim, as it says in the brisa haroda paschama v'nosnal pichavis yayin shel truma. Let's say a person takes a piece of freshly baked hot lafa and puts it on top of a barrel of wine that is truma, and the person who wants to eat the bread is a Yisrael. So the question is, does the bread absorb the aroma of the wine or not? So Reb Meir Oser v'Reb Yehuda Mater. Reb Meir says it's Oser, and Reb Yehuda says it's Mutter. Reb Yossi Mater b'shel chitin v'oser b'shel sarim. Reb Yossi says it depends. If the bread lafa is made out of wheat, so then it's not absorbent and it's okay. If it's made out of barley flour is much more absorbent, and then it's prohibited. Because barley is much more absorbent. So my lav tanoi. So let's suggest it's a machlokas tanoim. Demar savar reicha lav milsi, umar savar reicha milsi. If you hold the bread's permitted, it's because aroma is insignificant. If you hold the bread is prohibited, it's because you have to worry about the aroma of the wine entering into the bread. So the Gemara says, Levi vadai tanoi. So listen, the Gemara says, you're right. According to Levi, it surely is a machlokas tanoim, because Levi says reicha lav milsa. So according to him, why should anyone prohibit the bread? It must be that there's one opinion that Levi disagrees with, and he holds like the other Tana who says that it's not a problem. But l'Rav nema tanoi, is it a machlokas tanoim perforce according to Rav as well? So Amar l'cha Rav, no. Dekuli alma reicha milsi. Rav says, no, I could argue that everyone holds in the case of meat and meat that reicha is milsa. But over here, we're talking about a different situation. Because lavitmar ala de'ayi, amar Rabba bar barchan amar Reish Lakish, the Amoraim clarified this mission, and they said that bepas chama v'chavis pesucha divrei hakol aser. When you're dealing with hot bread and an open barrel that the bread is placed over, there everyone agrees that there's an exchange of aromas, and therefore the bread is aser. When you have cold bread and you have a seal over or a lid over the barrel, then everyone agrees that there's no exchange of aroma and if everything is okay. The only machlokus is when you have one and not the other. You either have hot bread and a lid over the barrel, or you have cold bread and a completely exposed barrel. That's where there's a machlokus between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi. And I will argue, says Rav, that the case of two pieces of meat roasting in the oven creates so much of an aroma that it's like a situation of hot bread over an open barrel. But it could be that even the person who says reicha milsa when it comes to two pieces of meat would agree that since the barrel is sealed or the bread is cold, then it's not a problem of reach. Tani Rav Kahana bereda Rav Chinan Asaba pas sha'afa im tzli betanur asal al-achla bekuscha. He says as follows, that if you bake bread in the oven at the same time that you're cooking meat, because of the reyach of the meat wafting into the bread, that bread is considered to be fleishich to the point where you cannot eat it with milchiks. Now, we're not saying that you have to wait 6 hours after you eat the bread. We're just saying don't eat that bread with milchiks. Ahi benisa da'atva bahadi bisra asarava mipar zukaya. If there was once a case of a fish that was roasting in the oven at the same time as a piece of meat, and Rava Mipar Zukaya said that it's prohibited l'meichle bekuscha, you can't eat the fish now with milchiks, with a kutach. So Bar Ravashi Amar afilu b'milcha nami asura mishum dekasha l'reicha l'davar acher. And he says no. He says that even to eat the fish in just some salt without milchiks is also going to be aser, because it's bad for giving a person a bad odor and for giving him tsaras. And the reason is because, and this is the general rule, that you're not allowed to mix fish with meat. It's not healthy. It's not healthy. And therefore, if a piece of fish was cooked in the same oven as meat, the fish is going to be usher to eat. However, that's not how we paskin. Fish and meat in the same oven is okay, according to the way we paskin, even in a small oven. It's the Dagul Miravava, if I'm not mistaken, says that, but it's been a while. But we generally paskin, that's okay. Yes, that's the minhag, is we so much are makbid, and it's not just the minhag, it's a halacha. We're so much makbid not to mix fish with meat that you have to have kinuach v'hadacha. You have to eat something, like a piece of bread, to wipe out your mouth, and you have to drink something to rinse out your mouth between fish and meat. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. We have to hurry. Chamisha dvarim boin betuma ve'ine cholin betuma. There are 5 types of communal karbanos that are so important because they are limited by time. They can only be brought in a certain time span, that if the only people available to bring them are tamei, they are still brought betuma. And, however, they are not eaten betuma. So if the kohanim who are bringing them are tamei, they have to be brought, but they cannot be eaten. What are the 5 karbanos? Ha'omer, the korban ha'omer, which is brought on Pesach. Ushtei alechem, the 2 loaves of bread that are waved over the mizbeach on Shavuos. V'lechem hapanim, the weekly showbread. V'zivchei shalmei tzibor. Now, zivchei shalmei tzibor, it's a little bit ambiguous what that means, but Rashi says that, at least at this point, it means a korban shlomim that's brought on behalf of the tzibor, which really refers to the kivsei atzeres, which refers to the sheep that are brought on Shavuos. And again, these are delimited by specific time frames. Useirei roshei chadoshim, and the goats that are brought on Rosh Chodesh as the korban chatas for Rosh Chodesh. Those are the 5. Now, haPesach sheba betuma nechal betuma shalaba mitchilaso ela la'achila. But a korban Pesach, where the Torah sanctions that the entire populace is allowed to bring it when the majority are tamei, like we've learned before, not only can that be brought as a korban in a state of tumah, but it can even be eaten in a state of tumah, because since the whole purpose of the korban Pesach is to be eaten by Klal Yisrael, it would make no sense to permit you to bring it as a korban and not permit you to eat it, because its whole objective is eating it, and therefore, if the Torah permits it to be brought as a korban, it also permits it to be eaten. The Gemara now says, Chamisha lemutei mai. Why did the Mishnah have to specify a number? Obviously, that's coming to exclude something. Lemuutei chagigas chamisha asar. It's coming to exclude the korban chagiga that a person is supposed to bring on the first day of Pesach, the first day of Sukkot, and the first day, and on Shavuos. The salka daita chamina kevin de korban sibur ukevia leimoe tidchi tuma. I might have thought that since it's also delimited by time, it can only be brought on the first day of Yontif, and it's a korban sibur, it's got to be brought by the entire populace, then therefore everyone should be able to bring it if everyone's in a state of tumah. So kamash malan kevin de islay tashlumin kol shiva lo dachya Shabbos, so midah Shabbos lo dachya tumah. The Gemara says no. The interesting aspect of the korban chagiga is this, that if you didn't bring it on the first day, you get to bring it on the second day, and you didn't bring it on the second day, bring it on day 3. You have all 7 days as tashlumin if you didn't bring it on the first day. So therefore, it's not as fixed in time as another kind of communal korban. That, by the way, that has ramifications today also. Many shuls have a minhag not to say tachanun for all 7 days after Shavuos. Why? Because that's the time of tashlumin for the korban chagiga, right? So therefore, there's an aspect of the celebration, or of that's what the word chagiga means, to celebrate, on the at least the 6 days after Shavuos as well. So the Gemara says, since it doesn't override Shabbos, because you can always bring it tomorrow, it also doesn't have that strict time delimitation that would allow you to override Tumah as well. So the Gemara now says, V'nisni nami si'irei haragolim. So the Gemara says, but why didn't you list also the goats that are brought on Yantif? You listed the goats that are brought on Rosh Chodesh. Why didn't you list the goats that are brought as sin offerings on Yantif? So the Gemara says, Hatana le'zivchei shalmei tzibur. That's subsumed under when we said all of the karbanos that are brought by the tzibur that are time delimited. That's what we were referring to. So the Gemara says, then why did you have to specify the goats that are brought on Rosh Chodesh? If you're saying any communal karban that is brought under a strict time limit is subsumed under the word Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, then why does Rosh Chodesh have to be listed explicitly also? So the Gemara says, Amri Sirei Rashi Chadashim Itztrichalei. I'll tell you why. Because Salkadai Techamina Haloksiv Behu Moed, that maybe the only time that the Torah allows you to override Tumah is if the day that you have to bring it is called a moed, a set specific time where God says you and I have to get together. And Rosh Chodesh is not called a moed. It's not a yontif, so therefore it's not called a moed. And maybe therefore it's not strong enough to compel us to override Tumah. Kamash Malanda Rosh Chodesh Ikri moed. And therefore the Chiddush of the Mishnah is that Rosh Chodesh too is called a moed. Kidei Abaya, Domer Abaya, Tammuz Dahashasa Meluye Malyuha. That Abaya says in calculating what day the Churban Abayas was, we have to know how many days the month of Tammuz was. And it says that, Rabbi says, that the month of Tammuz was a full month. It was a 30-day month and not a 29-day month. And how do you know? Because Kara alai moed lishbor bachurai. As it says in the pasuk in Eicha, that he has called upon me a moed, a full month, to break down my youth. But the point is that the word moed is used to describe the new month, the month of Tammuz, and therefore you see from here that that the word moed is attached to the month as well, and that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. That so too the karbanos that are brought on Rosh Chodesh also override Tumah. You have a ksiva v'chasima tov, everyone, and a wonderful day.